Hello everyone and welcome to a different kind of deep dive video, How I Would Fix Starfield. I'm your host, Colors Fade. Since Starfield's release, a lot of people, including me, have devoted considerable time and effort to dissecting where the game went wrong. I concluded my own analysis video by saying I didn't think it could be fixed. Others have echoed that sentiment as well. Modders were some of the first to say Starfield could not be fixed, and more recently, Luke Stevens polled a bunch of software developers in and out of the games industry, and they came to the same conclusion. Starfield's flaws are inherent in its design, and there's no way to fix them. But that got me thinking, what if you were given a chance to fix it? How would you go about doing that in a reasonable, realistic, and financially responsible manner? That last point is important because most things can be fixed with enough time and money, but that's not realistic. I want to approach this video by being as realistic as reasonably possible, at least for someone who doesn't work in the games industry. Full disclosure, I am a software developer, and in the past I've written code for video games, and I'm familiar with some of the tools of the trade, but by no means am I a game developer. I've dabbled. I know enough to be dangerous. Anyway, with the Shattered Space DLC on the way, I decided now is the right time to take a look at how to fix Starfield. I'm going to start by talking about the constraints one would have to operate under in order to fix this game. Certainly, we could come up with a dream list of features we'd like to see. I know first on my list would be seamless traversal like in No Man's Sky, but I don't believe that sort of functionality is possible with the creation engine. I think a big reason Starfield has so many loading screens and relies so heavily on fast travel is because of the limitations of that engine. So in order to talk about how to fix Starfield, we first have to deal with the realistic constraints we would inevitably face. How could one fix a game like this without changing the engine or overhauling the game in other financially irresponsible ways? As an example, I said in my own video that a huge part of what's wrong with Starfield is the writing. But I don't think you could fix the game with better writing, because the dialogue has already been recorded, and it would be costly and time-consuming to bring back all the core actors into the studio and record thousands of lines of new dialogue just to improve the story, quests, and overall quality of the game. Same goes for the loading screens and fast travel. As nice as it would be to have seamless traversal, I don't think you could reasonably do that with this engine. That doesn't mean the game couldn't be vastly improved with a few other changes that I do think the engine could handle, and it's these changes I want to talk about. Before I go any further, let me say I'm fully aware Bethesda isn't going to listen to any of this. You don't have to say that in the comments. This video is strictly for fun. Consider it a thought experiment. So with that out of the way, let's ask the big question. What if you actually could fix this game? How would you do it? I'm going to start with exploration because in my opinion, this should have been the core of the game, and I actually believe it's something that could be improved considerably given the constraints of the engine. Where Bethesda went wrong, at least in my opinion, is in placing structures all over every single planet, which meant that for all intents and purposes, there was no point to exploring. Every single planet has already been explored. The scanner quests are an insult to players' intelligence because people have clearly been living and working on every single one of these planets already. There shouldn't be any new information to gather. In terms of gameplay, this is pointless busy work. But what if most of the planets were actually barren? Or at least, what if they were supposed to be barren, devoid of human presence? Let's start by imagining a version of the game where the vast majority of planets are actually empty. No buildings or other structures. That's the starting point for everything I'm going to propose about this change. I think this setup would help make Starfield's story and gameplay make more sense, for one thing, and I think it would be far more immersive. After all, Constellation's mission is to explore the galaxy, presumably because everyone else is too busy with their own agendas. Humanity lost Earth, and as a result, they colonized a handful of planets, building up cities like Aquila, Neon, New Atlantis, and Sidonia. But they stopped exploring after a while, got back to their old ways of making war with each other, and so it falls to the people of Constellation to continue the work of finding habitable planets and founding new colonies. As a gameplay hook, I can get behind that. As it turns out, this is basically the core idea behind Fallout 4 as well. Preston Garvey and the Minutemen are all about rebuilding the Commonwealth, rebuilding humanity. And yet, for some weird reason, Bethesda didn't lean into this story arc for Starfield, despite it making all the sense in the world and despite all their experience already building a game on this premise. What I'm going to propose next isn't anything vastly different from what Starfield already does, only the way I'm going to propose it is it actually makes sense and would provide a much more immersive gameplay experience. Think about how the game would change if the vast majority of planets were devoid of human presence. First of all, it suddenly makes Constellation's existence make sense. The scanner missions then become a logical part of Constellation's story and the core gameplay. Constellation hands you a mission to survey a faraway world. You go there and from the comfy confines of your ship, survey the surface. At the beginning of the game, your sensor skill is low and your ship's capability isn't advanced, so everything looks fine. You fast travel to a random spot on the surface and start scanning flora and fauna, earning some credits and contributing to Constellation's mission. None of this is new. You can already do all of this in the game, but none of it makes sense right now because all of these planets are already fully occupied. But imagine how exploration changes when we land on a planet knowing it's supposed to be barren, and then suddenly we find out it isn't. We have several possible outcomes, and all of them could be interesting and surprising. What's not surprising is landing on a planet and seeing a half dozen huge structures in the distance every single time. But landing on a planet that's supposed to be empty and then seeing a structure? That would be a surprise. And it could lead to all kinds of interesting interactions and quest chains. Imagine landing on a planet where your scanners have not detected any human settlements from space. No structures, no ships, no reactor cores, nothing. But then you land and your spacesuit scanner is picking up a signal. Is it pirates? A smuggling operation? A cult of religious fanatics trying to build a secret colony on a backwater world, hoping no one discovers them? What if it's a criminal on the run? Or rich folks on a luxurious vacation, but their ship experienced technical difficulties and they crash landed with no working communications, so they couldn't send an SOS? What if it's a secret cult of cannibals who keep abducting settlers from a nearby planet? Or a gang of kidnappers? Rescuing the person they abducted and returning them safely home might yield you a nice fat reward. Suppose it's an illegal drug operation. Do you risk shooting it up and pissing off whatever cartel it belongs to? Or maybe it's just survivalists trying to get away from it all. It could even be a pair of kids who thought to live out their Romeo and Juliet fantasy because their parents don't want them to be together. But now they're having second thoughts about the whole venture because there's hostile alien life forms on this planet. And there's not much time for romance when you're spending all your time trying not to get eaten. Point is, exploration is fun when you aren't expecting to find anything. And if you've already surveyed a few worlds for Constellation and none of them held any surprises, then discovering human presence on a world would be fun and exciting, especially if the encounters were varied and unique. And that's another thing Bethesda has to get back to, creating unique encounters. Starfield gets panned because the encounters are carbon copies of the same areas over and over, auto-generated across a barren landscape. It's either a science facility or ecliptic base or pirates. Not only are all the structures the same with the same layouts and enemies, but there's nothing about these encounters that make them unique or interesting. Once you've experienced one of them, you've experienced them all. And the thing is, it's the unique encounters we remember. The ghoul boy in Fallout 4, locked in a freezer for 200 years, who gets reunited with his ghoul parents. Or a psychotic painter kidnapping victims in order to make art. How about a crazy old man fending off mirelurks with the love of his life, his old rifle Reba? There are bandits and raiders aplenty in Skyrim and Fallout 4, but it's the unique encounters that we remember, and that's what's missing from Starfield. Imagine surveying empty worlds, barren worlds, but some of them turn out to be not empty. Instead, they surprise us with unique encounters. Then we report back to Constellation and tell them what we found. Hey, this empty planet you sent us to survey actually had people on it. From there, we get new orders depending on what we discovered. If it's pirates or ecliptic, perhaps it's our job to clear them off and destroy their outpost. Wouldn't that be fun? Getting to blow up an entire structure and wipe it off the map? If it's a religious cult, perhaps we can actually roleplay. Maybe we are sent back to infiltrate them by posing as a new member. Our job is to find out if they're a threat, and to do that we use our speech skills. Maybe we need to persuade them to leave, or perhaps we can fool them into thinking that the planet is about to be overrun by the Crimson Fleet, who are eyeing it as a new base. Perhaps the planet has a pitch black style problem, and horrible creatures come crawling out of a mine where settlers dug too deep. The point is, anything that we could discover would be a surprise because the planet was supposed to be empty. And as the player, it's our job to explore and discover, and we'd be doing exactly that. And that would not only help make Starfield's story make sense, but also make it fun. Then there's the case where a planet really is empty. There's no people on it at all. Perhaps, though, it has enough atmosphere, a proper magnetic field, and enough flora and fauna to support life. Great. We report back to Constellation and they tell us they have some colonists ready to make a new home out of it, and it's our job to jumpstart the process by building an outpost. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Please, dear Lord, don't be turning Sarah into Preston Garvey, and I hear you. I think we've all had enough of that. But mods in Fallout 4 have shown us that settlements really don't need our input all the time in order to have a lasting and evolving impact on the game. What would really make this part of Starfield fun and interesting is seeing these outposts grow over time because of the work of the colonists themselves. We know this is possible because modders have built elaborate outpost mods for Fallout 4 like sim settlements. There's no reason we can't have outposts like that in Starfield. Outposts that evolve and grow over time without the player needing to micromanage them. Imagine leaving a small group of colonists with a few buildings and supplies, and then coming back later and finding a thriving town. How cool would that be? Or coming back and finding that some really dangerous creatures woke from hibernation and laid waste to the colony. Or raiders took over. The point I'm getting at here is that most of these what-if scenarios are things the game can already do, but it's the presentation that Bethesda got all wrong. If settlements were presented in this fashion as part of Constellation's ongoing mission to explore the galaxy and find more places for humans to live, then it would not only make logical sense, but it could actually be fun. Bottom line is, it's the surprise of exploration that's missing from Starfield. Right now, if you land on a planet, you know what you're going to find. A smattering of structures indicating human presence, and then some dudes in spacesuits that you need to kill. That's it. The same thing every time. But if most of the planets were actually empty, and Constellation survey missions served as a gateway to fun and surprising exploration encounters, then the joy of exploration could be injected into Starfield's boring gameplay. The second thing that could dramatically improve the fun and surprise of exploration is intra-system travel. We know that it's possible for ships to travel quickly across the star system because a modder made it happen. The game accurately tracks the orbits of planets, which is really cool, and it is possible to navigate from one planet to another. Unfortunately, at the other end of this journey is a flat planet. I don't think it would take much to do two important things, largely because other games from as far back as the early 90s have already done these things. First, give players some kind of pulse drive that allows their ship to travel quickly across the solar system from one point to the next. Call it a skip drive or whatever you want. Invent whatever technological reason you need to explain it away. Second, load in ships, space stations, and other objects as players approach areas of interest. Think of these like dungeons in Skyrim and Fallout. Because the thing is, a solar system is no different than a planetary map. It's an area that can and should be explored by the player. But in order for that to happen, traversal needs to exist. And not just traversal, but also dealing with what happens when you arrive at your destination. Space games have been dealing with intra-system travel and planetary approaches since their inception. Privateer had to deal with it, Freelancer had to deal with it, and recently even Rebel Galaxy Outlaw had to deal with it. And the solution has always been the same. As you approach a space body, the game automatically prompts the player to confirm. Do you want to land here? And if they do, then a landing cutscene is initiated. Starfield already has the cutscenes. There's really no reason they can't do this. But the bigger win here would be the ability to traverse the solar system at rapid speeds, because then you could explore. And while the player was zipping across the vast darkness, you could load in encounters. And I mean stuff more interesting than Grandma or a ship full of whiny school kids. I'm talking about derelict ships, space stations, asteroid fields with smuggling operations, huge battles between the UC and Crimson Fleet. There are so many cool surprises you could scatter all over these star systems, just waiting for players to discover. Imagine the community that might pop up around this part of the game. You'd have people logging coordinates, telling each other, hey, if you're in the Tau Ceti system and you head to these coordinates, you can find this really cool quest. Suddenly, Starfield would feel like an actual space game. The player, meanwhile, could decide to stop and explore these events or cautiously fly around them. It's worth mentioning that none of this negates fast travel. Players still want to hop quickly from one planet to the next, use the fast travel system. Imagine how much fun it would be to actually explore a system for the first time. Putting intra-system travel into the game and littering various systems with all sorts of quests and events would breathe a lot of life into this otherwise dead galaxy, and it would significantly improve the entire exploration aspect of the game. This brings me to my third change, bounty hunting. When the game launched, the only bounty hunting missions that were available came from the generic mission kiosks, and they were stupidly simple, tasking the player with killing a specific enemy at one of the game's generic locations or blowing up a ship in space. But I have to credit Bethesda on this front because they have taken steps to improve this aspect of the game with the addition of the Trackers Alliance update, which added a new quest that introduced some new bounty hunting mechanics. This is a welcome change, bringing additional depth to bounty hunting, which the game desperately needed. To augment the Trackers Alliance update, there are now mods that add things like handcuffs and functional brigs, allowing for a slightly more immersive bounty hunting experience. All in all, these changes are welcome and are a step in the right direction. However, despite these changes, the bounty hunting aspect of this game remains lackluster at best. For starters, finding bounties is as simple as using your scanner. There is no investigation involved. I shouldn't be surprised that Bethesda opted for the most simplistic approach possible, but alas, here we are. Personally, I think the game would be better served by adding a more fleshed out bounty hunting system. For example, imagine if you're contracted to bring in a bounty, but instead of simply wandering around using your scanner, you have to do an actual investigation. Look at the person's file, find their list of known accomplices, figure out where they spend their time. Do they have a ship? What does that ship look like? What's its registration number and name? Does your target have a system they call home? Now go find their friends, shake them down, bribe them, maybe engage in a small side quest in order to win their favor. Use those speech checks and persuasion skills to gather information. Narrow down the list of possible systems your query might have fled to. With a more in-depth system, you'd be doing actual detective work to try to track down your bounty. And then when it came time to face them, you could use a non-lethal weapon to stun them and lock them in your brig. Mods can make the latter half of this equation work, but not the first part, not the investigation and detective work. The introduction of the Trackers Alliance quest does showcase some of this by having you shake down a known accomplice, but this interaction is comically bad. I've mentioned in other videos how awful Bethesda's writing has become, and it doesn't get any better with this update. Between the lackluster voice acting and the weird tonal choices in the dialogue, where the writers can't seem to figure out if they want to approach this confrontation seriously or comedically, the whole scene feels amateur and unsatisfying. That said, if the developers were to add depth to the bounty hunting process by doing more of this kind of detective work, it would really elevate this part of the game. Imagine the cottage industry that might revolve around the bounty hunting profession. Special bounty hunters, spacesuits, backpacks, and other gear you could only get from bounty hunting merchants, or by offing your competition when they get in your way. Hell, that would make an awesome mission. You land at the suspected location only to find another bounty hunter that has beat you to it. Oh well, another target for your rifle. Point is, with bounty hunting as a fully fleshed out feature, and I mean a feature with depth, where the player has to use their skills of investigation and detective work, you'd be adding a very fun aspect to the game. Finally, we get to the part of the game where I think the most radical change is necessary, and I think it would make a huge difference. I'm talking about the main quest and the powers that players receive from it. Recall what I said at the start of the video. I want to be realistic as possible about how one would approach changing this game, and that means not changing the engine and not paying voice actors to come back into the studio and record new dialogue. That makes this part of this little thought experiment a real challenge, because I'm not sure if you could get adequate results with the existing dialogue. But let me lay out the idea, and you can decide. Let's begin with the acquisition of powers, or as others like to call it, space magic. This is one of the least interesting aspects of the game because Bethesda implemented it in the most boring way possible. Players hunt down temples and then float toward the cluster of lights until a cinematic plays. There's not much else to say. It's pretty anticlimactic. Many pundits, myself included, have said that if power acquisition would have worked more like Skyrim's dungeons, it would have been better. And the sad thing is that design already exists in Starfield. Bethesda just failed to recognize that they already had the perfect vehicle for distributing powers to the player, the artifacts. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. It wouldn't make any sense to grant the player powers via the artifacts, because Constellation already acquired some of the artifacts and none of those people have powers. How could we make that work? Well, if we tweaked it a little bit, allow me to explain. First, we have to take a step back and see the bigger picture. The core conceit of Starfield is the Unity, which exists solely for the purpose of implementing New Game Plus. On the surface, I like this idea because Bethesda actually did something interesting with their New Game Plus by giving the player and the NPCs completely new dialogue that openly embraces the idea of repeating content. Think about that for a second. Repeating content. Doesn't that sound a lot like a time loop? The obvious answer to New Game Plus is sitting right there, but Bethesda failed to capitalize on it. When the player enters the Unity, we're told that we're going to be sent to a parallel universe. But when we go, we're actually sent back in time as well, because we're sent back to the exact moment the game started. From the player's standpoint, this feels a lot more like time travel than universe hopping. So let's take that idea of time travel and expand on it. Forget about parallel universes. Suppose that acquiring all the artifacts and assembling the armillary initiates time travel, sending you back to the moment when you acquired the very first piece of the puzzle. And imagine that first piece you find back on Vectera isn't an artifact, but something else. It doesn't really matter what it is. Call it the armillary core if you like. The key point is that by acquiring it, it allows whoever touches it first to harness the individual powers from the artifacts. With that, we have an in-game mechanism to allow the artifacts, and not the stupid boring temples, to be the conduit through which the player acquires powers. And since most of the artifacts are found via dungeons and fun quests, the game immediately becomes much more entertaining with regards to space magic acquisition. But wait, you ask, what about the story? Doesn't this screw that up? Not if you're careful with how we change the story. This, as it turns out, is where I think a major overhaul could significantly improve the quality of the game. Let's start with the grab drive. It was invented by Dr. Victor Isa when he discovered the first artifact. But through experimentation on that first flawed designs of the grab drive on Luna, the Earth's magnetosphere was damaged and Earth became a wasteland. Can you think of a better reason to want to travel backward in time than to save Earth? Recall what I just said about artifact acquisition. With our changes, powers are now only acquired by the person who finds the armillary core, the thing you would do at the very start of the game. Dr. Victor Isa only found an artifact piece, not the core, so he would never have acquired any powers. Our change to the story remains logical and intact, at least with regards to the artifacts. The bigger issue, of course, is the Starborn. As it stands, the Starborn exist as competition for the armillary pieces. This is because Bethesda, in their infinite wisdom, wrote an entire game without providing a good antagonist. Oblivion had the Oblivion Gates. Skyrim had Alduin. Fallout 4 had the Institute. But Starfield has nothing, and thus the Starborn were created. Now, I'd be fine with nuking the Starborn right out of the game's story. I don't think they add anything substantial, and if I were to change Starfield's story to one of time travel instead of parallel universes, I think the various existing factions, like the Varun, Ecliptic, and Crimson Fleet, provide more than enough opportunity to create conflict. In fact, I think the coolest idea Bethesda could have run with would have been to have each faction wanting the armillary and wanting to go back in time for completely different reasons. And the game already suggests this a little bit to the extent, and that each faction kind of has their own belief about what the artifacts mean. But let's say you wanted to keep the Starborn in this revised story. How would they fit in this new time travel narrative? I think the simplest way to handle it, especially given the dialogue that already exists, would be to make the Starborn time travelers themselves. They've each built the armillary and traveled backward in time, but they can never go back far enough to save Earth. Each time one of them goes back in time, they start at the same spot where their story starts. Ours starts on Vectera, and we get the armillary core. Theirs starts wherever it starts, and they get a piece of the armillary, an artifact. They're always missing the core. It's lucky us who gets the core first. They have all come to the same conclusion over time, that in order to go backward in time far enough to save Earth, they need more than one armillary. They need 10 of them. After all, that's how many New Game Pluses you can do. This becomes the reason why they all fight over the artifact pieces. They're all trying to be the first person to travel back far enough to save Earth. Only some of them aren't interested in saving Earth. Some of them have other plans. Thus, it becomes incumbent on the player to not only complete their own armillary and travel back in time, but they must do this 10 times. And they need to be the first person to do it 10 times, so something even more awful doesn't happen. Once the player has 10 armillaries, they travel back in time for the final act. This is where the game officially ends, the player going back far enough to talk to Dr. Isa and warn him about the grave future that awaits Earth. Earth then builds its science and research outpost much farther away, like, say, Jupiter, and successfully builds the grab drive there. Earth becomes saved, and we get a final cutscene of our world. Of course, none of this explains the existence of the artifact. How did they come to be in the first place? But does that really matter? The game itself doesn't explain the temples or the artifacts. I'm okay with those answers coming later in an expansion. Speaking only for myself, using time travel for New Game Plus makes way more sense to me than the Unity and multiverse hopping. And it ties in nicely with the current implementation of New Game Plus. Not to mention, having a concrete goal for 10 iterations of New Game Plus would have given me a reason to try it. To me, this sort of change to the story would make the game far more compelling and enjoyable. So there you have it. These are the ways I'd change Starfield, without changing the game's engine and without spending more money to bring the voice actors back to record new dialogue. Could these changes work? I don't know, but I think it's fun to think about it, because the game as it exists today is lacking severely. The more I examine it, the more missed opportunities I see. We've seen games make dramatic comebacks before. No Man's Sky did it, and then Cyberpunk 2077 did it. It is possible, but Bethesda would have to want to do it. And I'm just not sure they think there's anything wrong with their game. I'm Colors Fade. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and a comment. Let me know what you think and how you'd go about changing Starfield if you could to make it a better game. Until next time, happy gaming, everyone.